And thank you all for joining, and a special thanks, and speaking of busy, to Dr. Jane Pinelis, who's our keynote speaker for today's edition of this T&E talk. I really appreciate you joining us and sharing your perspective on test and evaluation in the context of AI. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pinelis, who is the Chief Test and Evaluation and Assessment for the Department of Defense's Joint AI Center, the JAIC, Artificial Intelligence Center. Dr. Pinelis leads a diverse team of testers and analysts in rigorous test and evaluation for the JAIC. And she also develops T&E specific products and standards that will support testing of AI-enabled systems across the DoD. Prior to joining the JAIC, Dr. Pinelis served as the Director of Test and Evaluation for USDI's Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, better known as Project Maven. There she directed the developmental testing of the AI models, including models spanning computer vision, machine translation, facial recognition, natural language processing, and more. Her team developed metrics for assessing these AI capabilities. And additionally, she oversaw operational and human machine teaming testing, a very important part of thinking about AI adoption. Dr. Pinelis has spent 10 years working predominantly in the area of defense and national security. She has a background in operational test and evaluation, both in support of the services, specifically ComOpTev 4, as well as the OSC level. I previously had the pleasure of working with Jane when she was the test science lead at the Institute for Defense Analyses, where she managed an interdisciplinary team of scientists supporting the director and chief scientist of the department, the director of operational test and evaluation. One of the cooler things I think Jane has done in her life is her work supporting MACATIA, the Marine Corps Operational Test and Evaluation Activity. In that work, Dr. Pinelis led the design and analysis of a very widely publicized study, made it to public news and kind of those fun talk shows where they looked at the effects of integrating women into combat roles in the Marine Corps. And if you're interested in learning more about this work that she did, her and Paul Johnson co-authored a book entitled The Experiment of a Lifetime, Doing Science in the Wild for the United States Marine Corps. I highly recommend you pick up a copy. So in addition to her T&E background, Dr. Pinelis has years of experience leading analyses in the DoD in the areas of wargaming, precision medicine, warfighter mental health, nuclear non-proliferation, and military recruiting and manpower planning. Her areas of statistical expertise include design and analysis of experiments, quasi-experiments, and observational studies, causal inference, and propensity score methods. She has a BS in statistics, economics, and mathematics, an MA in statistics, and a PhD in statistics. And like me, did them all at one university, despite people not telling you to do that. Clearly, we're debunking that. It's an okay thing to do if you really like the university. All of her degrees are from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Jane, it is great to have you with us today. Jane, will turn the reins over to you to go through your talk. Just a side note on when people are putting things in the Q&A, I'll be popping up on video to ask Jane those questions at kind of timing is deemed appropriate throughout the talk, but we're going to try and keep most of the Q&A to the end of the session. Jane's planned a talk that will allow us plenty of time for that. So with that, I think next slide, and we'll turn it over to Jane.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to get an opportunity to talk to you. And thank you very much to Kara and Mimi as well for supporting this. So my name is Jane Pinelis. I'm currently the Chief of Test and Evaluation at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center in the Department of Defense. My team really kind of has two functions. Our first function is to provide the robust testing capability to all of the JAIC AI products. So whether it be model testing, system integration, human factors, or operational test, my team is responsible for providing that for our own products. But we also have an important second mission, and that is to enable the rest of the department and their test and evaluation community to test AI-enabled systems as they come online. We do that through the provision of various guidelines, best practices, and tools and methods, as you'll see a little bit in this talk. So with that, next slide, please. This talk is really meant to be on the progress of test and evaluation of AI in the last couple of years. I have been around for a lot of it, both at Project Maven and at the Joint AI Center. And I can tell you that probably one of the biggest advances that we've actually made is we've changed the conversation about T&E. Test and evaluation is traditionally viewed as your last briefer before lunch. I say this as 1 o'clock, as probably most of you have finished. As a hoop that somebody has to jump through before deployment, as a box that needs to be checked. In fact, we're changing the conversation now to really talk about test and evaluation of AI-enabled systems as a true opportunity for asymmetric advantage in the AI arena. And I think the leadership at the Department of Defense is actually hearing us. We can tell that in our conversations with them. We can tell that from the JAIC processes and how testers are incorporated in the entire development process. And frankly, we also notice that in the way that our leadership talks amongst themselves. So what advantages does T&E really provide? Oh, and by the way, before I get to those, there's a lot of conversation happening, I would say somewhat erroneously, about test and evaluation delaying fielding. In fact, a couple of things are true. One, test and evaluation does not necessarily delay fielding at all. Fixing the problems that are found in T&E does, but that's literally what test and evaluation is designed to do. But I would also argue that it's not correct to say that we always need to be fastest, right, in delivery of our systems. We need to be better and we need to be timely. Whether we need to be fastest probably depends on the specific situation. But nevertheless, back to asymmetric advantages of doing rigorous test and evaluation of AI. Probably the biggest advantage we get out of it is that our system designs are actually much more robust. We know what kind of standards and requirements we put out. Our industry partners know the kind of testing that will occur on their systems, and our systems come delivered to us already considerably better. But also, right, we get the opportunity to fix any issues that come up. Again, that guarantees us much more robust system designs. Additionally, as we test these systems, we get a much greater understanding of their performance envelopes. That might, at this point, seem a little bit easier, perhaps, for traditional systems, but for AI-enabled systems, it's a lot more difficult to understand their performance envelopes. It's a lot more difficult to characterize the circumstances in which they work well, in which they work badly or not at all, whether that degradation is graceful, whether the failures are graceful. And so being able to characterize that is a tremendous advantage. Following that, being able to pass that information to the warfighter, right, to the user of this technology. Now these users can leverage these capabilities much more confidently and effectively, and importantly in the US especially, much more responsibly, right? So when we get to the discussion of AI ethical principles that the department has adopted, T&E is one of the places in that development process where we get a chance to assess compliance with the AI ethical principles. And I'll give you some examples of that later on. Also, in a nascent field like AI, T&E really enables the kind of discovery, experimentation, and innovation because it's taking us some time really to develop best practices, to develop standards for safety, transparency, ethics, reliability. It's with T&E that we get the long-term strategic advantage that really comes from experimentation and innovation. And then finally, and this is a well-known benefit of T&E for all systems, we buy down technical debt down the line. Especially with AI-enabled systems, problems are very difficult sometimes to diagnose and to localize and to fix. Particularly when you have combinations of AI-enabled systems, it becomes especially hard. So by doing T&E early and often, you're giving yourself a much better chance to diagnose and localize problems and also to fix them before fielding in a way that is faster, cheaper, and better. And again, importantly, not only did we come to all these conclusions, but I think the Department of Defense leadership actually understands and firmly stands behind these. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the DoD clearly has to update its test and evaluation process for AI. The current process has been working for us very well for some time, but it starts being less effective for software intensive systems, and it's really exacerbated by AI specifically. One of the kind of thorns has been that we are used to bringing in existing practice for test and evaluation from science, right? From statistics, biostatistics, operations research, psychology in some cases. And we're also used to borrowing a lot from industry approaches. And this is one of the places where some of the industry approaches do not really apply. And the Department of Defense really has to be at the forefront of developing our own science and method and metrics that come with test. This comes from the idea that our mission set is very different from that in the industry. Our tasks can be extremely dynamic and poorly constrained. Success is very hard to define and measure in some cases, and in some cases is literally not measurable. In some cases, it's very hard to find a counterfactual to a question of, you know, how many lives that this technology save or something like that. We are unable, for instance, to crowdsource labels and evaluations the way the industry is able to do. Our test data is a very precious resource, and in general, Department of Defense data is a very precious resource, but test data is a special snowflake because we really want to ensure to withhold and carefully curate that test data so that it never leaks to our industry vendors, and we can always use it for tests. So we can't crowdsource labels, which means that they're that much more expensive to obtain, to QA, and then to govern. We cannot test through fielding the way that Apple can, right? When they have a new OS, they have millions and millions of willing testers who hop on, and the consequences of failure in that situation are not disastrous. Right? For us, failures can be absolutely catastrophic and result in loss of life, as opposed to, you know, an Apple example or a Netflix example where the wrong movie gets recommended. So there are certainly still many, many, many things we can learn from the industry, and we are absolutely collaborating with the best of the best in the industry. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But there are some problems that are very unique to the DoD. And we're having to kind of lead the frontier on that. We find ourselves unable to test in the entire operational space of interest. Now, technically, that's an old problem. We've always had a sample size problem in DoD testing that we've got pretty good at solving, I would say, in most cases. But now we're at the point, these systems come with enough uncertainty to us where generalizing test results, you know, even interpolating between test points is hard, let alone extrapolating past some kind of a point where you've tested. So having said all this, the DoD really needs to solve this problem by integrating adaptive T&E processes, by integrating dynamic testing, iterative testing across the system lifecycle. And I think the department is behind us. I would say that probably the current organization within the DoD does not necessarily support that. But having said that, the culture, I think, is changing and people are on board with what needs to be done, which is in and of itself also progress. Next slide, please. You can just build the whole thing. Thank you. One more. Thank you. So if you looked, you know, a few years back and what the testers were doing at the time, and I would argue probably still doing in some pockets of the DoD, people were really generating custom solutions to their unique testing need. These custom solutions didn't really work for anyone else, but people were starting to meet, they were starting to talk in working groups and try to identify the scope of the challenge for T&E of AI at a very high level. This needed to happen, right? In order to even start creating some kind of best practices, we need to actually practice. But it did lead to a bunch of siloed approaches. There wasn't really concrete guidance yet on test and evaluation of AI. And so there wasn't, it wasn't easy at all to collaborate, and nobody could wait for anybody else to figure out what guidance is. They just needed to start building and to start testing. In the last couple of years, there's been a lot more emphasis on generalizable research and more concrete frameworks. And the JAIC has been a very active participant in those endeavors. There's been a thrust of effort really to integrate very low and very high levels of effort. So at a very high level, we want to create concrete, useful guidance, methods and tools. And we're collaborating considerably, especially with the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation to do so. But we also want to be grounded in good theory. And we want to come up with methods and tools that are reusable. And so we end up also collaborating on a very low level, so actually sharing technology. And I'll give you some examples of that later on as well. So now we've got the low and high level collaborations going. We absolutely have a coalition of the willing. And that is definitely great progress. But ultimately, if we are to permanently be useful and move beyond this coalition of the willing, beyond this kind of test community that is very tight knit, what we need to do is we need to scale. So implementing the kind of T&E strategy that we talk about across the Department of Defense will really require significant policy and structural changes to how we approach T&E. And so the good news is that we've started coordinating across the T&E community to start tackling these issues. The main organizations that we tend to collaborate with, one is DoD T&E, the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. We collaborate with them on all things having to do with policy and frameworks when it comes to T&E of AI. We collaborate with developmental test evaluation and assessment as well on more kind of, I would say, practical issues in T&E of AI. We have a very strong partnership with the Test Resource Management Center, TRMC. That's the organization that's given charter and resources by Congress to maintain test infrastructure for the department. And we also work quite a bit with DARPA because the problems in test and evaluation of AI are so innovative and so hard that DARPA actually is taking some of them on. And we're then able to be on the receiving end of some of their projects. We work a lot with service labs as well. So Army and Air Force research labs, et cetera, they tend, as well as with FFRDCs and UARCs, because all of those organizations tend to be at the nice level of intersection between research, as these are largely very new kind of problems, but also practice and kind of the operational focus that the JAIC needs as a fielding kind of organization. Some examples of collaboration, one, for instance, especially with DARPA, we have a great collaboration on several efforts. One is on URSA, the Urban Reconnaissance Through Supervised Autonomy project. It's really around the ability to send unmanned assets into an urban environment to identify threats to coalition forces. And so it's very much a DARPA hard problem. The piece of it that the JAIC is interested in, and the piece of it that we're really collaborating on, actually has to do with the legal, moral, and ethical implications of a project like this. And so we're, to the extent that it touches the DoD AI ethical principles, we're having those conversations. DARPA, of course, has the explainable AI program. They're trying to increase traceability of AI systems and therefore hopefully positively impact user trust. The JAIC will be on the receiving end of that capability. We work with DARPA CAML, the competency aware machine learning. That has more to do with expressing model performance across different human understandable formats. We work with the Army Research Lab and the Air Force Research Lab extensively as well, especially on the Skyborg and project program and project convergence as well. And we have some of our own projects that we have been able to leverage support from others, right? Like Smart Sensor at the JAIC, like Project Gargoyle, which is a force protection project, and of course, Project Maven elsewhere in the DoD. With all of them, we've kind of been able to collaborate on various levels, in some cases on a framework and metrics level, in some cases on a software level, and in some cases data sharing. Let's go to the next slide, please. So really the current integration efforts between all organizations fall into three broad categories. One is research, right? So the science of test for AI is still a little bit young, is still a little bit immature. It is of a lot of interest and people are pursuing it, but it has not evolved at the same speed as model development. So developing formal methodologies to measure, model, and analyze AI system test results is still very much a research question. Then we have frameworks, which is really guidance that largely the JAIC has tried to put out that will empower non-experts. Empowering non-experts is really critical for us in the Department of Defense because attracting and retaining the kind of workforce that we need to be experts at test and evaluation of AI is very difficult. And while we're working on those workforce questions separately, in the meantime, our goal is really to arm those testers that the department does have with enough knowledge and enough guidance to try to test these systems appropriately. And then the second thing that those testers need, of course, is the resources. And so any kind of instrumentation, test beds, ranges, infrastructure, or even test harnesses, test software, we try to integrate where possible with other organizations. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you some examples of those three buckets. And admittedly, some of them are slightly confusing because I would argue that frameworks are in some case, some guidance is in and of itself a resource. So you'll see that I kind of sorted it not exactly according to those bins. But as far as the research piece and really advancing and inventing new T&E methods, we've seen a ton of focus and a lot of advancement of human system integration. There's been a really renewed focus on human factors that I'm really happy about. Many people erroneously believe that if you automate tasks, you need to test less with humans in the loop. In fact, the opposite is true. If you give the human now limited touch points with the system, but a human is now in this much more limited context, is expected to interact and potentially trust the system, then testing around human factors is just incredibly important. There's a lot of research going on sequential test design, right? So given the points that you've tested and the results you have to date, what is the optimal point to test? There's a lot of great work going on at IDA, at JHU-APL, at DoD T&E, and other places with regard to that. There is a lot of conversations happening about learning systems. How do you provide continuous assurance when a system is able to update that it's still good? Explainable AI, of course, is a really big question. At what level of explanation do you need? And how do you assess if an explanation is good? How does that change with different types of users? And really what is required and what is too much? There's a lot of focus on responsible AI. That focus largely has been dictated by the Department of Defense, who, we have our leadership who's very interested in AI ethical principles. And so we've been working at the JAIC a lot at the intersection of responsible AI and T&E to figure out how do you really measure adherence to these principles as part of the T&E process. And of course, a really ripe area of interest is adversarial AI and red teaming. We've seen a lot of advances here at DARPA and also at MITRE, which is the FFRDC that we often partner with for this kind of work. Next slide, please. So frameworks and guidance, right? That was one of the really big pieces that frankly was missing in the Department of Defense a couple of years ago. We needed some documentation of what a best practice actually is. At the JAIC, we have an opportunity to lead several communities of interest. One that I lead is a DoD-wide AI executive steering group, working group, subcommittee on test and evaluation. I know it's a lot of words, but the bottom line is that anybody who is a stakeholder in test and evaluation in the Department of Defense gets to participate in that, including OSD and service partners. And so with them together, we were able to put together a document that outlines all of the facets of test and evaluation of AI-enabled systems. We call it the AIES T&E Framework. And not only did we talk about all of the facets of it, we also talked about the gaps. And the fact that we all agreed on a set of gaps that we all as a department needed to fill was really helpful, because now we can work very systematically and together to try to fill those gaps. We also partner a lot with the Institute for Defense Analysis, but also internationally with DSTL, for instance, in the UK. And they're really leading the way in developing something that goes beyond T&E, something that builds an assurance case for a system as a function of, some sort of empirical T&E results, but also kind of formal proofs, and in some cases more philosophical and logical arguments. And that will really be instrumental for AI T&E, because there's frankly no way that our traditional T&E will completely answer all of the questions that we had. The JAIC has also come forth with a system integration test and evaluation framework. So how do you test for when you've taken the model and you've bolted it onto a legacy platform? What are all of the pieces of that interaction that you need to worry about? As I mentioned, we also have a human system integration T&E framework. We're currently working on, and I'd be remiss not to mention others who work in that space. There are many, but we work especially extensively with Carnegie Mellon University, with Sandia, who have, they have come up with the human equivalent of TRL, the technology readiness level, the human readiness level, which has been really interesting. And then we're working in a couple of other areas right now at the JAIC. We're working on a framework for operational test and what changes when you go from a traditional system to an AI-enabled system and operational test. And as I mentioned before, at the intersection of T&E and responsible AI. And of course, the arguments that you need to assure trustworthy autonomy specifically, we partner with IDA on that. Go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to just give you a very, very quick glance at some of these products that the department has. This is a very, very small piece of the JAIC TNE framework for artificial intelligence enabled systems. It describes our tailorable kind of testing approach that we have to all of our systems. And at the heart of it, we have kind of four parts of that puzzle, four pieces of that circle. One is algorithmic testing, so measuring a model basically in a lab setting against requirements and against a specially reserved test data set that is usually hard to curate and therefore is very precious. We talk about system integration in that context as well as human factors testing and an operational test, right, where we take the system, put it in its realistic operational environment with a real user and against a realistic adversary when that information is available. And then the kind of four verticals across which we tend to do that kind of testing. One is what we call integrity testing, which is, you're just testing your tool for basic measures of goodness under normal conditions. We also talk about model confidence and model competence in terms of estimating and reporting model confidence in the context of domain adaptation. We talk about robustness to natural perturbations. And then we also usually test for resiliency to cyber and adversarial threats. So the framework that the JAIC has written with this working group outlines all of the pieces of this process in much more detail, as well as the gaps that currently exist. Next slide, please. This next piece is as a piece of our system integration test framework. And really, I'm not going to make you read through all this, but these are the 5 basic concepts that we tend to focus on. And we're finalizing that framework now, at which point we'll be able to work through it again with that entire community of interest and subsequently, hopefully, adopted as the framework for testing system integration. But really here, we worry about things like functionality and interoperability and all the other abilities as well as security, rather than how well the system is performing. We just care that it turns on, that the data flow in the way that they're supposed to, that things don't shut down, et cetera. Next slide, please. So next I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the resource piece. And under resources, I'm actually going to still show you some of the frameworks that we've produced because they kind of cross over from framework to resource. But some additional pieces that are worth discussing. Some of the resources, excuse me for a second. Can you hear me okay still? Yeah, okay. Some of the resources are purely technical, right? Like a test harness. So that's software that's used to test other software. And the JAIC has procured a test harness that we use, and we're able to actually share it with others, which is fantastic. We've already had the Army and Marine Corps be able to use it. At the same time, others have also shared with us. In particular, Project Maven through JAIC APL had a great test harness that we really wanted to use for something. The Test Resource Management Center was able to facilitate that transition for us. Or we also routinely work with the Air Force Research Lab because they have some test capability that we just don't have, and it's completely ready to go, and they have the people to help us use their technology. So that's been really great. Another resource that is a little bit unexpected is our T&E BPA, or the bulk purchase agreement, which is actually a contract vehicle, and I'll show you what that looks like on the next slide. It's an unexpected resource, one that we didn't know we needed until we ran into some contracting issues. Another technical resource that we sometimes collaborate with JAIC APL on is RAPT, or the Range Adversarial Planning Tool. So the idea here is that the problem when you're trying to test the interactions of autonomy with its environment is just too hard. It's NP hard. And so they provide a method for identifying the right test cases near performance boundaries, where a small change in the scenario or in configuration might result in a big change in system performance. And so they actually use an active learning approach to find those test points. There's also a test data capability that we're actively working on with the Test Resource Management Center. Some of it is a collaboration with Virginia Tech University and with Laura's team, actually. But the idea is that test data is such a precious resource that we really want to be able to govern and to share it properly. The JAIC, with the help of the Test Resource Management Center, is building a T&E factory, which is going to be a suite of T&E tools that test across integrity, competence, robustness, and resiliency. And then there's a lot of good work going on at the Defense Acquisition University on training, for instance, and at TRMC for T&E of autonomy. Go to the next slide, please. I wanted to give you a quick overview of the T&E BPA, the bulk purchase agreement. At the end of the day, the simplest way I can describe the problem that we had is when I needed to get industry help with test and evaluation of AI, and I had willing industry partners, and I had the funding at the JAIC to get their help with, I still had trouble obligating that money. In other words, the DoD really lacked contracting options for this kind of work. Evaluating AI is novel enough to where it was really hard to obligate work. And at the same time, we knew that we really needed help from the industry when it came to T&E methods, metrics, data, and especially technology. And we needed to be able to rapidly and repeatedly produce T&E services. There was no procurement vehicle that covered all of the services that we needed. And so the JAIC acquisition team helped us come up with this bulk purchase agreement that basically now enables us to have a set of partners among whom we can very quickly compete test and evaluation work. And so can others in the department. It's open to DoD and federal networks, and even available to our international partners. And so we've really been able to create a high quality T&E service with already pre-negotiated contracts that others will be able to use. Go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, thank you. Here, I wanted to give you an example of another JAIC resource, and this is also a framework. It kind of falls into both of those categories, but I really feel that this is in fact a framework and a resource, because I think the DoD was thoroughly behind on testing for human factors. And what we've been able to do as part of our human system integration framework is we've been able to tie, on the one hand, the kind of questions that we want to answer, we tie them to the OODA loop. That's what you see on the left: observe, orient, decide, and act. But we were also able to tie them very directly to the DoD AI ethical principles, which is really good news, because that means that as we test for human factors, we're also testing for DoD AI ethical principles, and it's not necessarily a lot of additional test design or test overhead. And where we always try to keep testing exactly to the level to which the system needs it, and not test for testing's sake. So as part of the human system integration framework, we basically try to answer questions like whether the warfighter is able to understand and predict the situation. Do they have the information they need in the form that they understand at the time that they need it? Are they able to make good decisions about how to use their system? And are they able to actually get the system to do what they need it to do? That's kind of the high level of that framework. Go ahead to the next slide. In practice, that's a much more complex endeavor, which our framework spells out. And you have here, I realize it's an eye chart, but it's just the list of all of the human factors concepts that come in handy when you're trying to measure these sort of things. For example, as part of observe and orient, you might talk about a mental model that the user has of the system, and whether you've provided the user enough transparency into how the system works so that their mental model enables them to predict how the system will act. As part of the decide piece, this is the user knowing when to use the system effectively. And so when we talk about warfighter trust, that's really where that comes in. It comes in as measuring things like complacency, over trust, under trust, and performance envelope understanding. And then under ACT, we have several concepts, but probably usability and function allocation are the most familiar ones, right? We want to make sure that the user has oversight and control of the system, and that all the functions have been allocated appropriately, but also that the user actually finds the system useful and usable and easy to use, and able to use it to accomplish their intent. Next slide, please. Another product that we're working on is our operational test framework, and where operational test of an AI-enabled system looks different from that of a traditional system. And this one also is kind of a framework and a resource at the same time, because it's coming with a set of techniques and a set of methods kind of available. One of the biggest differences, I guess, that we're recommending, and granted, this was already recommended for some traditional systems as well, is the idea that operational testing occurs early and often. So we call it tactical testing, but the idea is still that you have smaller but more frequent tests building towards IOT&E, and that you design those tests in a sequential fashion to go across multiple environments and a variety of threats. We also, in this framework, make a really important point, I think, about failure modes, right? So by definition, traditional T&E kind of approaches, they tend to focus on quantifying risk, and then I would say avoiding risk. I would say that with AI-enabled systems, we're getting into systems that are so complex that complete risk avoidance is not really an option. Even full risk quantification is probably not an option. We cannot test for everything. But what we can do is we can design and then test our systems so that the failures are graceful, and so that failures have so that we have an opportunity to mitigate those failures and recognize them as they start occurring. Next slide, please. So to kind of start rounding this out, scaling to the enterprise level is really our next big step. It will require a tremendous amount of policy and coordination. I think we do have kind of a willing coalition of partners with whom we can do this. But the key is really, what's the big picture for integrating T&E throughout the life cycle of AI and autonomy? We need to continue building on the research to improve and develop new test methods, right? And you already saw some glimmers of hope there today, I hope. But we want to be able to use T&E results to adequately characterize performance in order for us to start building that assurance case. We need to identify who all of our stakeholders are and then figure out what kind of assurance cases we need to build for those stakeholders. We need to provide the test community with the resources, and that's probably the biggest and hardest gap to fill. We have needs for infrastructure, right? Think of the problem now that we have. We need to really supplement operational test with modeling and simulation, with synthetic data, with live virtual constructive test. All of that is actually quite expensive and time consuming to design, to procure, to build, and even to use. So some of the other common solutions need to be elevated. That's a big resourcing question. We also need systemic processes and common architectures. We need to facilitate cooperation between testers, between program officers, and between all of the different stakeholders. Again, we're seeing some hope there. The JAIC is already participating this year in the CAPE issue paper process, asking for some of these resources. We know that these conversations are happening. We know that the department is aware of the needs that we currently have. And as always, we need to advocate for workforce, and we need to invest in our workforce. In the end of the day, if you have everything else in place, but your workforce is not mission ready, then you won't be able to scale this. We already have the collaborations among DoD, government entities, with industry and with academia, and even with our international allies to jointly pursue T&E solutions. But investment in the workforce is probably still, I would say, where we're struggling. But that's, I think, true across the AI portfolio in the DoD. And then finally, we need to continue to leverage our research and collaborations to gain a consensus and make progress towards the challenges that are still unsolved. Some of them are methodological challenges like sufficient coverage for ill-defined operational spaces. Some of it has to do with things like runtime monitoring systems that are out in the field and recertification of these systems. We need a strategy for modeling and simulation and for live virtual constructive test environments. We need a strategy for synthetic data. And we need a strategy for testing responsible AI configurations. So there's still much work to do. Go to the next slide, please, in order for us to scale. But some final thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, rigorous T&E and a timely T&E capability really is a strategic advantage. And I think one of the biggest signs of progress is that our leadership agrees with us. And this is being echoed all across the Department of Defense. The science, policy, and infrastructure for testing AI-enabled systems have not kept pace with their development and have not kept pace with the modernization. And so that's kind of where we're focused next strategically, because in order for us to scale, science, policy, and infrastructure need to keep up. Again, tremendous progress have been made, but there's much more to be done. And we have, I think, a great test community in the department right now who all agree on the challenges and are willing to work towards them systematically. And lastly, I want to kind of give a shout out for our FFRDC and UARC community, because I think that you are absolutely uniquely postured to help with a lot of these issues You tend to be right at the intersection of, cutting edge academic research and operational importance, operational relevancy. And so for us at the JAIC, FFRDCs and UARCs have been fantastic partners already, and I expect that to continue. I'll take your questions at this time.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. It's been, I couldn't figure out when the best time to pipe in was. So that was, your talk has generated a lot of questions. So I'm going to dive right in with a collection of them that are kind of all systematically aligned. So there have been questions from the chat on where can we access the frameworks and the resources that you've referred to in this talk. And then a related question, are there published guidelines and best practices for T&E of AI enabled systems?
These are all great questions. So I'm happy to distribute materials as required. So please contact me. I usually just send them out. Right now we're still working by pull rather than by push. Some of these are finalized through our comms department. So some of them we only distribute within the DoD as opposed to outside of it. But I'm happy to do what I can there. And then as far as published, lines and kind of, we're working with the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation on that, because the JAIC, we do have a policy team, but we're not really the T&E policy setting organization. So we work with the services, we work with OSD, on these guidelines, but we have not yet finalized a formal policy, I guess, with DoD T&E. And I think that will probably be our next step.
Great, thank you. Moving to the next question. Do you envision a use case approach to the future of T&E of AI similar to the approach of safety assurance being used for autonomous vehicles? Mission assurance is proven intractable using formal methods or proofs of ML-based AI. And black box simulation wastes a lot of time on unimportant scenarios in the operational domain.
Wow, that's a big question. I'm going to try to deconstruct it, I guess. So use case based, do think that is how it has to be. I don't know that there's another way. In some cases, for instance, on Project Maven, I know I'm doing mission kind of T&E, but it's really hard. The use case for each individual was different. Their mission would change throughout. And so as a result, the problem really became dynamic, right? And so the T&E, to see whether your system is solving that problem, also becomes dynamic. It does help to have that kind of where, of an agile kind of development cycle where T&E is involved early and often, so that as the requirements change, so does T&E. But yes, I do think use case specific test and evaluation will be helpful. I share your frustration with black box M&S. I do think there are some kind of scientific approaches, including a tool like Raft that does help you identify formative test points. So I don't think it's practical. And I will also say the idea that a system is to us as a black box, there are ways around it, right? There's frankly a contractual way around that. And I know that both the JAIC and DoD T&E are very interested in starting to build in testability into some of our contracts so that it's not a completely black box system. But even with black box systems, some of the things that we found is there's only so many approaches really to design them. And so it's not, even when a system arrives to us as black box, that doesn't mean that we know nothing about it. And that doesn't mean that we cannot design our tests intelligently. But your point is very well taken. And I do think that use case specific T&E is absolutely part of this tactical approach that we're recommending.
Excellent, thanks. I've got a question from Swala about data rights for ML testing. Has that been a problem you've ran into in the past? And I know you hit at the very end, just kind of general thoughts on how the department should address data for AI ML.
Wow. Well, with AI ML, first things first, data is key, right? And that's well understood. we are working through, we have a data governance council at the JAIC, right? And we also have a chief data officer in the DoD. So probably most thoughts about data, I would probably delegate to Dave Spurk. But as far as the JAIC goes, I think we place a lot of importance on the one hand, keeping government data, as it belongs to the government, right? And sharing it, at least the training part of that data, in a very careful way with our industry partners, so that the data are always protected from our side. And then, but at the same time, we want to be able to share data amongst ourselves in the government, right? Because again, procuring the kind of data sets that are really state of the art, that are, of really good quality, that are very representative of our operational environments, that is an important department priority. And frankly, it's also very costly, right? So we really want to be able to share it. On the test side, there's an additional layer of protection that those data need, because we want them to never leak outside of the department's test organizations, so that we keep retaining them as kind of withheld test data sets. We have a great partner in the Test Resource Management Center. They're actually building a test data lake. And the hope is, that multiple organizations will donate their test data to that data lake, and that we'll be able to reach into it for our needs. Of course, figuring out whether data from one event or one customer is actually good enough to be used as test data for different customers and entirely different questions.
All right, switching gears a little bit. I've got a question from Chris DeLuca on how do you test for trust?
It's a great question, Chris. I will be happy to share with you our human system integration framework that outlines some of these concepts. I will mention two things here. One, and that's not exactly what you asked, but it's just a really important point to make, is at the JAIC, we try not to talk about building trust, right? We try to talk about properly calibrated trust. And that's how we use test and evaluation, is to calibrate trust in a lot of these instances. So we don't want the warfighter to overtrust the system, rely on it too much when it in fact should not be relied upon. And we don't want the operator to undertrust the system and not take its inputs when that's actually required. So that's number one. Number two, I'll give you just a tiny preview of testing for trust. One of the manifestations of trust is reliance, right? So, and this is what makes T&E for some of these systems different from T&E of traditional systems. Well, if I'm testing a tank in the field, I'm usually not going to give the operator an option not to rely on that tank to accomplish the goal, right? But with an AI-enabled system, that is at least one way to design some of those experiments, is to allow the operator to not use the system if they are finding it unreliable and untrustworthy. So that's just a little preview, but I'd be happy to share the framework with you that outlines a few more methods.
Wonderful. So we've gotten questions from both academia and the FFRDC communities on how do they find ways to engage with T&E for AI and cyber. This is an area that they're working on.
Sure. Please, my information is very public. I connect with everyone on LinkedIn. You can find me there. You can find me speaking at multiple conference events. And we're a tight-knit community in DoD T&E. So I think many of us, frankly, probably already know each other. But we're very happy to collaborate with industry and academia, and especially, I think, FFRDCs. We've had a really great run so far. And I should mention, cyber is currently, at least to my division at the JAIC, of special interest. So if you have that problem, I'm even more excited to talk to you.
So a follow-up question related to security and cybersecurity. Have you contemplated tests, and I know you love metrics, so have you contemplated testable metrics for security of AI systems? For example, resilience to cyber attacks, spoofing.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we have contemplated those. We have, quite honestly, made more progress on the red teaming side of things than on the adversarial AI, I should say, side of things than on the cyber side of things. They're not entirely distinct, but we already have a guidebook that's coming out for adversarial AI testing. And I suspect the next framework that we will work on is cyber. But thankfully, cyber is a slightly older problem. And I think DoD T&E already has a lot of guidance and a lot of knowledge in that area. And they've offered to help us with it. So we're excited to collaborate with them on that.
All right, so what kind of AI testing outcomes are applicable to troubleshooting, maintenance of operational availability of systems of service?
I'm sorry, I may need to hear that question again.
What kind of AI testing outcomes are applicable to troubleshooting or the maintenance of operational availability of systems of service?
So I think the closest that we've done at the JAIC, we do have a joint logistics mission area. And that area, generally speaking, lends itself really well to AI, or at least so one would think. In practice, we've encountered a lot of issues with data quality on some of those efforts. It turns out, really not surprisingly, I guess, that there's a lot of art as well as science to those data sets and to how joint logistics works. But having said that, we were able to work with an engine. This was a couple of years ago, so pardon me for having to recall it a little bit slowly over here. But we did work to provide an AI-enabled system that was able to correctly predict engine hot starts in helicopters. And so for us, that was a relatively easy question as far as metrics, because we had a very easy question of, within an hour, will the engine overheat? And so we were able to collect that data. It was a success and failure kind of analysis. I'd be curious to hear about your specific problem, and maybe then I could be of more help.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with all the questions going on, but I think we are at the end of our time for today. So wanted to give you one last question that I think is very important from Miles. Do you have any suggestions on how to move the DoD to support continuous testing and validation in support of T&E post-acquisition?
Oh, wow. That is a fantastic question. And it's a question that we have asked ourselves a lot. Particularly, the area that we tend to focus on is not even post-acquisition, but post-deployment. And whose responsibility is it to keep assuring these systems once they're deployed and once they're potentially dynamically changing or being attacked or drifting in some way? I would say that probably providing that capability is the job that we have in T&E. I think the rest of it really falls to sustainment, but even then we have a really huge task of actually educating those who are receiving on what the kind of runtime monitoring will take. I can tell you that we're now just taking our first real foray in the department into runtime monitoring of some of these systems. And so I'll probably have a better answer for you in a few months.
All right. Thank you, Jane, for your engagement in your talk today. And thank you, everyone, for the great questions. Before everyone drops off, I want to advertise there was a question about how do you get more information on this. You could back up one, Mimi. I'll flag the last in our T&E series talk is going to come from Dr. Sandra Hobson, who's she's the Deputy Director for Strategic Initiatives, Policy, and Emerging Technologies. She will be joining us in December, so please come back for that. And also next week, we are still accepting registrations for our SERC research review. So if you go to the next slide, on Tuesday, we will be having conversations about Acquisition Innovation Research Center. You can sign up to come in person or online. Wednesday and Thursday are fully virtual, and you can see the topics that we're going to be covering are very important ones, including digital engineering, AI, autonomy. So hope to see you all at those events as well, even if just virtually. Thank you again, Jane, for your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity.